Hi, friends, and welcome back to the Smart Catholics show. I'm pleased to be joined today by Karen Deere from Catholics in Recovery and Father Matthew Bartow, who celebrates Mass on EWTN, plus a bunch of other things besides. And today we're catching up. I'm catching up on what the Holy Father is up to because there's new things going down every week. This week we're talking about the Vatican's suggestions to the United Nations for a ceasefire for Palestine. Something having to do with Tuesday. I'm going to ask Father to fill us in. We've also got something interesting with renewable energy plan for the Vatican. And then lastly, I'm drawing a blank. Father, what was the third thing that we wanted to talk about?
So you mentioned John Henry Newman.
That's right. John Henry
There's
Newman
also
being made a doctor of the church, what that means, a little bit about him. And then if we get into any extra time, Karen always has a wonderful highlight from a recent homily or something that we can talk around. So thank you both for joining us. And friends, if you haven't yet, subscribe, hit the like comment. Well, hit the like button and then drop a comment saying hi in the comments, and we can respond to your thoughts and questions next time. Why don't we start, Father, with the Palestine ceasefire request or a suggestion or something made to the United Nations? What's going on with that? Why is that worthy of note to know about?
Sure. And of course, all of us are aware of the dire situation that's going on in Gaza right now and with the Palestinians. And there's been several outlets or outfits that have basically said that the people are on the verge of starvation. And there already have been people and even children who have died of starvation. I've seen several AP articles, that have talked about that and shows the pictures of the children. It's really hard, images to watch. And so the Holy See has naturally been very much following this situation. Pope Leo XIV has called multiple times for a ceasefire, that they need to get humanitarian aid into the Palestinians right away. And so they've been really pushing for this. And it seems that recently the Holy See, meeting with the United Nations, has, of course, reiterated the need for a ceasefire, between Israel and Palestine, that humanitarian aid needs to get to them. And have also said that really the only solution that they see to this whole situation is to have a two-state solution, for both states of Israel and Palestine to be established, and also, that there are borders defined, so that way they can become their own sovereign nations. Obviously saying it is one thing, but then working towards the solution is a totally different thing. But if you have the United Nations working behind this, that can help to move things in the right direction. So it's obviously something that we have to continue to pray about, and certainly pray for the poor people on the ground who are still suffering, as a result of this situation. I mean, a lot of those Palestinians, they had nothing to do with what happened to Israel, which was a horrible thing to happen with Israel, and on October 7th should never have happened. But the response to it has been just so, disproportional to, what has actually taken place, that, that innocent people are suffering as a result of it, and that should never happen.
When you use the phrase a Tuesday solution, is there a history to that thought or that phrase? I've not heard of that. What does that mean?
Two state solution.
Oh, a two-state. I'm
Yeah, two
sorry. I thought you
states.
meant like
Yes.
a day of the week. I'm like, okay, history I don't know about.
Sorry, I might have been talking a little too fast.
No, it's fine. Thank you. Karen, is there anything that you would like to add or weigh in on this story?
I think as just a Catholic Christian person, when you hear about all the suffering and the tragedy over there, and the hostilities and true horrific, probably crimes that we don't even know about that are being committed by humanity or whatever the political stuff involved in over there, it's just. And then I'm over here in my nice home and living in the United States. That's the kind of things that I wake up thinking about. And you wish, I think through my faith and what it means it says when one suffers, we all suffer. Well, and I've heard a lot of different theological expositions on this, but we can't really fully comprehend it. And then how do we take that yoke with our brethren over in the Middle East here through prayer and just heartbreak? And what can the average person do here? I pray, and thank goodness we have the church and whatever outreaches there might be. But this is all over the world with whatever kind of issue. Things happened, horrible things happened that we don't even know about. That's kind of, I don't go dark, but I just, as a Christian, what is our response to be here in the United States? And how do we discern our way forward in being helpful or kind, or trying to listen to Pope Leo and what he's saying about in communication? I was reading about it today that he says, we hope our communication heals and doesn't hurt. That our dialogue would not be from a source of violence or anger or hatred, which divides at least the church. So I think it speaks to a lot to our faith here in the United States, and how we're to live that out prayerfully and in consideration of the suffering that's going on over there on both sides.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. Father, what would your response be to someone? Well, it sounds like survivor's guilt. It's something that I've struggled with. The more that I hear about bad things that happen all over the world, and I get stuck between, two attitudes. One being cultivating a state of sympathy and union with those who are suffering, and then at the same time, on the other side, realizing there's nothing maybe I can physically do right now, and perhaps there's an argument to be made that in an ordinary, course of events, I would never even know about half of this suffering, and only those who are able to do something about it would. And so for me to obsess over it, I end up losing a ton of inner peace and retweeting a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually help people because I don't have the full story. And so then my brain just spirals and stuff. So survivor's guilt has been a theme that I've struggled with. As you say, yes, we live in the first world West. I don't think we should be ashamed or sad about that. And I'm just going to punt that back over to you, Father. What sort of consolation do you offer people who bring this sort of thing to you?
Sure. I mean, there's obviously different levels to this. On the one hand, we don't want to be entirely indifferent to the plight of people in other nations, and this is something that's actually helped me, studying Catholic social teaching, because I've really been reading through, social teaching nonstop really for the last 4 or 5 years. So I've been trying to allow it to inculcate and to really inform the way that I'm thinking, and to try to bring it out. But one of the things that comes through in Catholic social teaching is that the wealthier nations, the ones that are developed nations, the ones that are doing very well, they actually have a moral obligation towards the nations who are still in need of development. Obviously, we cannot be exploiting them for their resources. We need to, if they do have certain resources that we need to engage with them in fair trade and bartering and so forth to get those resources from them and so forth. But we also need to be doing what we can to assist those nations to try to, eliminate whatever barriers they might have from, access to, all of the basic necessities and things like that. So there's always this idea of solidarity. But as far as on the individual level, individual citizens living in the United States, I mean, any one of us, each one of us talking to each other here, there's really nothing that we can do for the Palestinians, on a personal level for them. Does that mean that there's nothing that we can do? No, of course not. There are certain little things that we can do. And as far as, moral obligation to do those things, that really has to depend upon, what the Lord is calling us to do. Some people might actually be called to pray for, the Palestinians, or, if they're able to contribute whatever they can, for them. But there's some people who are not able to, contribute. They're still struggling to make ends meet themselves, and to try to maintain just a basic standard of living in the United States too. So the obligation is not going to be the same for every single person. And so, obviously the situation should make us uncomfortable. We should never be comfortable with a situation like this going on in the world. But at the same time, I understand that there are people that are dealing with, their own personal guilt about things. Am I doing enough for this situation or not? And obviously there's no way that I could fully, give a good answer, a satisfying answer to that. You kind of examine yourself and say, okay, this is what I can do. This is what I can't do. You try to do the best you can, moving forward with that, and trusting in the Lord. And I think that's an important factor in all this, is that we do need to entrust these people to the Lord, and to ask the Lord to deliver them, from this situation. And to remember too that, as Christians, it's not just about loving other Christians. Jesus has pointed out, it's easy for us to love those who love us, but we also have to love, people who are outside of our faith as well. And I'm not saying that, all Muslims hate us, or, all Jews hate us, or anything like that. But it's still important for us to look beyond, the walls of Christianity, and still see them as our brothers and sisters. There are Muslim brothers and sisters, there are Jewish brothers and sisters, and so forth. And to want the same thing for them that we would want for ourselves. We're living in comfort. We have all of our food, we have our shelter, and so forth. And this is exactly what we should want for those people as well.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, we want to come back to the conversation of John Henry Newman being made a doctor of the church, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But I want to ask about something else you mentioned related to the Vatican, which is they have some, what was it, a plan for renewable energy or something, or a deal cut with the country of Italy or the government of Italy for something to do with renewable energy. You said that was interesting.
Yeah, so it looks like the Holy See has signed an agreement with Italy for a renewable energy plant. And this is for I had never actually heard of this before. It's an agrivoltaic plant. Have you guys heard of that before?
A what? Agrivoltaic?
I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's for an agrivoltaic. And I tried to look that up a little bit, but it's basically a sustainable farm that uses solar power that basically contributes to actually saving the amount of water and the amount of sunlight that is used for plants. So basically, it provides the plants at the farm for just enough sunlight that they need, to continue to grow and to develop and so forth. But then the rest of the sunlight is used for powering the plant. So they'll use
I
it,
see. So
for
it's
solar
not blacking
power.
out the ground and denying the ground
Yes,
necessary
exactly.
sunlight.
So it's not like a lot of wasted sunlight. It's basically just going everywhere, but you can actually use it with the solar panels, and apparently it saves water. It's very clean energy that they can use in these plants. So it seems like the Holy See is really trying to move forward with what Pope Francis had written in Laudato Si, and working with scientists and even with secular governments and so forth to implement the things that Pope Francis had written about in the See. And it's good to see that Pope Leo XIV is continuing with that same trajectory that Pope Francis had laid out.
That's excellent. Do you see the Vatican is trying to not just break ground, but lead the way in terms of what is preached or what she teaches, also trying to live that out? Something like this. I mean, it's such a tiny little, it's a completely landlocked state. And so to be trying to be proactive in that instead of just like, just let the Italian government figure out what they do on their timeline. But as an independent state, to be trying to, I don't know, figure out the mechanics that are needed for themselves to be more, would they be independent or just it would be more renewable?
Yeah, I think it would be. It's definitely like a renewable energy plant. And I think I haven't really read the entire article, but I think it's actually on Holy See property, so it would be something that belongs to the Holy See. But I think
Wow.
it's
Okay.
some sort of collaboration that's taking place between the Holy See and Italy on this one.
So interesting. Karen, any thoughts come to your mind about that?
I just love, I'm so grateful that from Pope Francis and Laudato Si and Pope Leo's continuation of that there is a continual, a renewed focus continually on the stewardship of the earth and how we care for creation. I'm not sure if you read scripture and you read the Bible, and especially Romans 8 and Revelation 21 and 22 about the new heavens and the new earth. Paul talks about the whole earth is groaning for renewal and rebirth in Romans 8, and I'm probably rephrasing that a little wrong, but that of course God is involved in creation, and that is definitely our responsibility to do our best to take care of what the Lord has created. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that Pope Francis addresses in his encyclical, Laudato Si, is the obviously our responsibility to care for the earth. That's something that's been given to us by God. And that we're supposed to be stewards of creation and stewards of all the resources that we enjoy, so that way we can help the earth to bear more fruit. But also it has to do with protecting the poor as well, because it's often the poor that are affected by different environmental degradation and things like that. We often don't see it ourselves, kind of gets pushed out of the cities and out of the rural areas and things like that. But then it ends up, in the slums, and they're the ones who actually have to suffer with all of the environmental degradation, and even people who, because of rising sea levels, they're starting to lose their beachfront property and things like that. It's starting to become a real issue, for some people. It's obviously like an issue that still needs to be addressed. That's the Holy See is trying to lead Catholics to understand that this is our responsibility as well, to care for the earth.
I'm grateful for Laudato Si, and that what that document does in leading the charge. As Christian followers, it's also a moral obligation to We'll care for our common home and for the human family proactively together. So let's talk about Henry Newman. For the sake of argument, why is he a big deal? Why is he being pronounced a doctor of the church? What is the influence that, and for both of you friends, what is the influence that he has brought to the church for those who have perhaps never heard about him?
Sure. St. John Henry Newman, he's very much known for his teaching, especially his philosophical and theological contributions. Probably one of his most well-known works is the Grammar of Assent, and you guys may have read that before. I'm not sure.
Let's pretend not. It sounds like it's about how we understand things to develop and improve. Is that what that means?
Yeah, and honestly, it's not a work that I'm familiar with as well. I bring that up because that's a work that is very much used in many different philosophical courses, theological courses. Especially like one of our brothers, that was really the only textbook that they used for one of the courses. I think it was for epistemology. So it's basically the study of how we come to know things, or how we come to gain knowledge and so forth. And so I think he addresses some of those questions, in that book. But then he also has contributed to the development of doctrine. He did, write a pretty extensive work on that as well, and how doctrine develops. I think he's also been a contributor to ecumenism as well, and I think that might be one of the major reasons that the church is looking at him. Not just as a doctor of the church. I think doctor of the church is going to cover basically all of his teachings, but also him being an example for all of us, in engaging in ecumenical dialogue, especially since he was, an Anglican himself, an Anglican convert himself. So that makes perfect sense.
Wow. I've got some questions I want to come back to, but Karen, did you have any thoughts you'd like to weigh in? Are you familiar with him and his work?
A little bit, yeah. I've looked him up over the past couple of years, a couple different times. There's a website for the Catholic community that is under his name, devoted to, that says, these colleges and universities are truly under the umbrella of truly being Catholic. And it's some sort of list that uses his name. But I do remember that he was, in looking him up, that he was an Anglican who came, converted into the Catholic Church, and that was pretty cool. So, and I knew he was a teacher, and that's probably why he's over that education umbrella for the colleges, Catholic colleges and universities that are really embracing, I guess, what certain groups would see as truly Catholic teaching, that these colleges and universities are staying faithful to that. So, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Father, I'm curious to go more into the whole ecumenism thing. So here's my understanding, is that for somebody to be designated a doctor of the church, they will have contributed something or enriched our understanding of a specific point of the gospel or its application in a way that exceeds perhaps ordinary development of what universities or colleges or individual bishops and so on were trying to figure out. Or however, so for somebody to be a doctor, they're elevated because they've made a significant contribution in development of understanding, something like that. If that's true, what would you say, or how do you understand his contribution? Is it specifically, as you've mentioned, development of doctrine and then ecumenism? And if that's the case, what was it like before, and now, how is it different?
Sure. I had actually wanted to read his essay on the development of doctrine. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten around to it. But I believe that's going to be one of the most significant works that the church is looking at, especially since, from what I understand, there really hasn't been that much that's been written, on just following how the church develops her doctrine, over the ages. I don't really think people really considered that issue very much, in the Middle Ages and, going through the High Middle Ages and so forth,
Right,
through
right.
the Protestant Reformation and things like that. And, the church became pretty strict about, doctrine, around that time of the Protestant Reformation, trying to, of course, to defend doctrine from, degradation and so forth, and, from different heretical beliefs and so forth. But, there's been more of a consideration of this in more recent times of, well, how exactly does the church develop doctrine? What do we mean by development of doctrine? Does it mean that doctrine changes substantially, or is it more of a seed growing into a tree? And things like that. And I think that's actually one of the images that Cardinal Henry Newman uses or John Henry Newman uses in his book, the development of doctrine, is that it's almost like a tree, that is growing from a seed and blossoming out. And the church, it's basically unfolding before the church, and the church is acknowledging, this development that's taking place in doctrine. So it's not so much that the church is saying, well, we were wrong back in the first century, and now we're getting it right in the 21st century. It's more of this organic development that has taken place. And there's certain elements maybe that we weren't quite focused on as much, in the early church, that are now being focused on more. And it doesn't mean that anything has changed necessarily as far as substantially changed, but there's been this development, kind of like an organic development with a tree or even a person, things like that. We can say that, like, I'm the same person that I was when I was 3 years old, but I'm certainly not acting the same way as I did when I was 3 years old. I don't have the same amount of knowledge as I did when I was 3 years old. It's been a lot of development that has taken place throughout my life. And I think John Henry Newman really is able to bring that out and to, help to explain that. I'm kind of like, you had St. Vincent of Lorraine also talked about the development of doctrine a little bit, but I don't think there's actually been anybody who's really made a serious contribution to it like John Henry Newman. So I believe that that's probably the main work that they're focusing on.
That's excellent. What do you see happening now that he's being made or celebrated? What do you call designated or honored as a doctor? Is there a
Basically
verb?
being named as a
Named?
doctor
Okay.
of the church.
What do you see happening next? Is it another feast day on the calendar? Is it going to create an additional impetus in seminaries and colleges to study him more deeply, do you think? What do you see happening with this?
I believe so. But like I said, I don't think it's really widespread. It's not every single university, every single seminary that might be focusing on his teaching, although they might touch on it here and there. But once you're declared a doctor of the church, then your teaching takes on a lot more weight, and especially if there's a specific focus that the seminary wants to have, like especially on the development of doctrine, that would be something that would be very, very important to teach, I think, in seminary, and to help seminarians, future priests, to understand this is how doctrine develops over time and so forth. We did have a little bit of that in seminary, but I think studying St. John Henry Newman might actually be very helpful, in that regard. And it's not to say that seminaries will focus just on the doctors of the church, because there's certain doctors of the church that we just never hear any of their teaching about. But when you see someone who's designated as a doctor of the church, then you're more likely to say, okay, what's so interesting about this person that I need to study, what they've taught. Maybe this is something that maybe they're trying to clarify certain points of doctrine that maybe people have a lot of difficulty trying to find clarity on. You look at Saint Therese and you think, why is someone like her, doctor of the church? She wasn't, a professor in a seminary, or, she didn't have like a high education or anything like that, but yet she was able to contribute something that was so profound to Christian doctrine just from her little way, and that was a revolutionary teaching, that we received that, a lot of people maybe didn't really understand as well until, Saint Therese was able to present it in her own way. But she's not really taught in seminary either. We don't have they do have a course on Saint. They did have one in our seminary, but that was an optional and elective course if you wanted to take it.
Yep. And then last question, if I may, for those who are just not too sure what to do with this ideas we're talking about, and obviously we can't get into everything, but I'm curious in your mind, why would you say it's a good idea for more people to take, like students, maybe seminarians, priests, or college students, whatever, take a minute extra to understand this concept and why it's important? I think there's a reason why it's emerged at this time in our history. I think that he was a very formative influence on the Second Vatican Council and a lot of the reforms, if that's the right word, or the changes or the improvements, clarifications that were made. So what would you say for people who are wondering, why do we need to spend any time on this? There's already so much to figure out with the gospel and everything else we're trying to apply, and why is some extra time on this a good idea?
I think you just hit on it right there by mentioning Vatican II, because there's I'm going to say a misconception of a lot of people who think that everything changed after Vatican II, that basically the church just threw everything out that happened before Vatican II, and now we believe all different new things, and there's been this substantial change that's taken place in doctrine. And I'm kind of going with the extreme position on this.
Right. Yeah.
You'll find people both on the left and the right who will believe the same thing. They'll say that, yeah, everything changed after Vatican II. And it's like, yes, there were some significant changes that take place in Vatican II. But it's important for us to understand the difference, first of all, between development and substantial change, in doctrine, but also the difference between change in doctrine and change in discipline. And because discipline always flows from doctrine, and discipline can always change depending on what the church is trying to accomplish, in a particular time in history.
So
And
to be
sometimes
annoying, I'll just
that focus can
clarify
change.
the doctrine as the way you're saying it would be, here's what we understand, and then the discipline is, here's what we do about it, or here's how we apply
Yes.
it.
Yes, exactly. And the discipline might actually change depending on how the doctrine develops as well. So we'll see examples of that, especially like with the maps. With the changes that took place with the liturgy, which is something that is rooted even all the way back to Pius X and so forth. He was already talking about implementing certain liturgical changes and things like that with the liturgical movement. In the early 20th century. So, I mean, there was roots in the changes that took place with Vatican II, even well prior to Vatican II itself. And it was for this to develop this understanding of the laity being involved with the life of the church, which is something that, a lot of people weren't really getting as much of a sense with, prior to Vatican II. And there was more of this sense of as we call the common priest of the faithful, which is something that the church has always taught. It's just something that has now been brought out more with the changes to the liturgy, helping people to understand that no, all of you also have an active role to play in the life of the church. And it's because all of you have an active role to play in the life of the liturgy as well, and it flows from your active participation in the role of the liturgy. And we carry that out into the world, and we actively participate in bringing the gospel out into the world afterwards. So that's why there's discipline. These changes in discipline are so important, because it helps to remind people and to teach people, how they should try to conduct their lives outside of the liturgy as well.
Yeah, and that's why there's this renewed, not just interest, emphasis on the culture of encounter and the culture of synodality
Right.
with the church. If we're also supposed to step up to the plate and also not just carry some of the weight and the load, but be involved, then we should also be involved in the process of what we're doing as church. And Karen, I want to punt that over to you. And any thoughts that you would like to add to what Father was saying there?
Yeah, well, it brought up a couple things for me. The John Henry Newman tree blossoming on understanding or doctrine. There was an analogy that was used on, and I don't remember the writer. It might have been Mike Lewis. I can't remember, but on Pope Francis Amoris Laetitia, his writing that he was developing the pastoral branch of the church. So that was giving birth at that time. And I'll never forget that, because it made sense. And also something else Mike repeated, and I think he was repeating Pope Francis, maybe, but I've never forgotten it. And it's, everything that Father Matthew is saying, but it's said it, that doctrine doesn't change, but how we understand it might. And so that has always stuck with me and helped me to better understand what might be happening in the Catholic Church right now, and why there's, why so many people might be challenged by it. Vatican II, as a person who went to seminary and, I have my Master of Divinity and studied the Bible, when I started reading some of the council documents from Vatican II, I clearly saw a beautiful several branches blooming of nothing but the gospel mission. I'm like, here's the gospel in full bloom right in front of my face. So I saw just nothing but beauty. I'm like, I want to be Catholic. And then so to hear all the criticisms and how that's twisted just didn't make sense to me. I'm like, why is this so hard to see? But it I think it was calling the Catholic Church out of its comfort zone, and where Pope Francis was continually saying, we've got to stop being so self-referential. We've got to be people on synodality. We've got to be listening to one another, dialoguing, participating in church, growing the church. So those were the things that came up for me. And I love this conversation. So
That's
grateful
wonderful.
to
And
be here.
as you were talking to, as you were talking to, when you were talking about the tree growing, with Laudato Si, I mean, we see that so many times happening with Pope Francis. And of course, Pope Francis was extremely challenging. He was a challenging pope for many of us. Even though I loved him so much, he still challenged me too. And actually, that's what I want. I want a father who's actually going to challenge me. But one of the things that was really difficult for a lot of people was when he made the change to the death penalty. And that's a perfect example of something where we see a development of doctrine, but we don't see an actual substantial change, in doctrine. Because people were trying to argue, saying, well, the Pope, death penalty was always been taught as not being intrinsically evil. Now all of a sudden the Pope's saying it's intrinsically evil. first of all, it's not exactly what he said. He said it's inadmissible. He never said it was intrinsically evil. That aside, the development that's taking place of the doctrine is that Pope Francis was reminding us of the perennial teaching of the Church of the dignity of the human person, and also the fact that condemnation is not something that is part of the gospel message. And so to advocate for something like the death penalty just runs completely contrary to the gospel message, where Jesus has come to bring salvation. He's come to bring forgiveness. He's come to bring healing and mercy. He hasn't come to bring death. So it contradicts the gospel message entirely. Not to mention the fact that, of course, we have countries now who are able to protect society without having to put down criminals, without having to release them in society either. They can, keep them locked up and not have to put them to death, and they still have the opportunity for salvation. That's exactly what we want as a church. We want them to be brought to salvation. So it's really a development of doctrine. It's not a contradiction, of doctrine. It's just, there's a lot of confusion about that.
It's like the whole science thing with, the church, and that faith and science don't go together. I clearly see that God made the world. And so we're discovering in science what that looks like in physics and chemistry and biology. And so that somehow correlates to this, how we see doctrine somehow, I believe. Right.
No, scientific advances and scientific observations do contribute to development of doctrine as well. And that's how we come to understand doctrine better too. So the church always listens to science. I know there's been shaky relationships between science and the church before. I understand that. But overall, the church is very open to science and very open to scientific discovery.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the universe and physics and chemistry and just the basics of all that. Not when we take it to the extreme to where it might be unhelpful.
Sure.
What I'd love to invite Karen, as we close out this conversation today, to read your own contribution. You've got a highlight perhaps from a recent homily, something that moved you.
Well, I have several highlights here. And this one this goes back to June 4th, a general audience, and where Pope Leo was still teaching on the parables. I'll just read. Can I read 2 short paragraphs here? Okay.
Please go ahead.
And the originality of this landowner is also seen at the end of the day at pay time. The master had agreed to pay the first workers who go into the vineyard at dawn 1 denarius, which was a typical day's wage. He tells the others he will give them what is fair. And it is right here that the parable provokes us. What is fair? What is fair? For the owner of the vineyard, that is, for God, it is just that each person has what he needs to live. He called the laborers personally. He knows their dignity. And on the basis of this, he wants to pay them, and he gives all of them 1 denarius. The story says that the laborers from the first hour are disappointed. They cannot see the beauty of the gesture of the landowner, who was not unjust, but simply generous, who looked not only at merit, but also at need. God wants to give his kingdom, that is, full, eternal, and happy life to everyone. And this is what Jesus does with us. He does not establish rankings. He gives all of himself to those who open their hearts to them. And I had to read that several times, especially that last line. He does not establish rankings. So that's why you have, Saint Therese of the Little Way, that she was able to be a doctor of the church. And anybody who's willing to open up their heart to Jesus, he hears us. I just love that.
So, Karen, I'd love to come back to you on that. Father, I saw some pretty emphatic nodding throughout some of that. So what was going through your mind?
Sure. One of the things that I was thinking about when you mentioned that is, a lot of the unfortunately people in our country who, have this notion that, we live here and, we're not going to open our doors to other people, who are looking to escape whatever it is that they're trying to escape from their previous countries and to seek a better life here. And it's so contrary to the attitude that we hear from Jesus in the gospel, where some of them just work for 1 hour and they're getting the same pay that the rest of them received. And of course, the ones who got the pay for working 8 hours, however long they did, throughout the day, they received the just wage for their pay. They weren't being cheated, by it. And it's the same thing with us. I mean, we live in America. We receive all the benefits that we're supposed to, at least, receive all the benefits that we're supposed to in the United States, and yet, we're kind of stingy when it comes to people who are trying to seek a better life for themselves. It's just there's many different ways that we can reflect upon that and say, how can I adopt more of a generous spirit, like Jesus, where yes, he's a just God, but he's also very merciful too. And I think we focus too much on the justice part, without remembering the mercy part as well.
Thank you. Karen, any closing thoughts for us?
This just reminds me that the Lord is, I think I mentioned it a little, and this has been staying with me, that where Jesus says, if God knows when a sparrow hits the ground. I mean, our God is so sensitive and so present. Out of all of the universe, Jesus is saying he knows when a sparrow falls to the ground. How much more would he not care for us? And so I think being sensitive to his presence at every single moment in our lives is a practice to cultivate, and to remind ourselves of how generous and loving and patient he is. And that's what this reminds me of. He's ready. And Pope Francis said Pope Leo has said there's no cry he doesn't hear. So if we can just open our minds and our hearts to realize that God is here for everybody. And wow, there's theology and tons of intellectualizing about all of these things of church teaching and canon law, that at the very heart of it is the heart of God and his love for us all.
Well, I've got a short, I guess it's a joke, but it's a very old one, so everyone's probably heard it, but it feels appropriate, which is, I've often run aground with that same thing when things feel dark. And so I call to mind that same one about the lilies of the field and, every hair in your head, and God knows what you need. Your Father knows what you need before you ask for it. And I run aground on that because sometimes it feels like, well, where is it? And there's, what is it? It's this story of a man whose home is stuck in a flood, and he climbs up onto the roof and there's nowhere to go. And so he's begging God to come release or save him and help him. And then before the water's too high, somebody comes by on a horse and goes, "Hey, come on, I'll get you out of here." And he goes, "No, no, no, God will save me. God will save me." And the waters get higher. And so a boat comes by and is like, "Hey, come on. No, no, God will save me." And then water's, up to his ankles now, and there's no more boats, and the water's too strong, and a helicopter comes overhead. "No, no, no, God will save me." And then he drowns. And then he says, "God, where were you?" It's like, who do you think sent everything? That so that practical attention to meeting God, meeting Christ, the presence of the Holy Trinity, the good things of God in your daily life. The hardest thing I find is having the eyes to see, paying attention to the good things that are being offered, and that will just bypass if you're not trying to pay attention. And if you don't, sometimes we don't even know that we're supposed to pay attention. And so a story like that, or scripture verses like that, sometimes can give you the confidence to not be manic about specific outcomes, like, I don't know, a support kit dropping out of heaven, as opposed to maybe your neighbor coming over and asking for your help with their drain, and then realizing, I've just made a friend. Maybe this helps 2 months down the line. But let's practice good common human decency to all people, no matter who they are. And let's,
Amen.
work with the human family here, something like that. Anyhow, thank you both for joining us today, friends. If this conversation was helpful and if it brought up any questions, please say hi in the comments. We love to hear from you. Every time you hit that like button, you help somebody else out in the YouTube wilderness maybe find us and learn more about our mission at Smart Catholics to have hopefully helpful conversations like these with people, to study the popes and learn to have productive conversations about how to be Catholic, build a smarter faith so that you can have a smarter life. So hit like, hit the subscribe, say hi in the comments, and maybe come check us out in our free community, smartcatholics.com, free of trolls and ads and toxicity, with some absolutely wonderful, kind people in there, all looking to do the same thing, which is study our faith together, talk about what's going on in the world right now. How do we be Catholics in the modern world together? So Karen and Father, thank you both so much. God bless you all, friends. See you soon.
Take care.
Mhm.